now.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Diane Porterfield from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for this presentation, Listening to Community Users in Academic Libraries. This discussion is being recorded and it will be made available to Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the Pennsylvania Library Association website and also on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you will only need a headset or speakers. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout the discussion, and we'll attempt to include your questions as appropriate during the discussion or at the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues. Please post those issues to the chat box as well. Listening to Community Users in Academic Libraries is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, Sarah Pike, who is also doing our closed captioning for today's session. Thank you very much. Aaron Burns, Amy Schneider, Amanda Avery, Ryan Sittler, and Ronali Xioko. I'd also like to acknowledge Pennsylvania Library Association for allowing us to bring you this discussion through Zoom. We will be keeping track of attendance today, so please type in the number of attendees at your location if more than one of you is watching. This session is also offering 1 CE credit for participation. A link to the form for requesting proof of the CE credit will be provided at the end of today's session. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our panelists for today's event. Monica Singh is a business librarian for the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. She works with RUSA's Business Reference and Services section to produce topic-specific business guides and has written reviews for reference sources for business librarianship journals. Celia Emmelhainz is the Anthropology and Qualitative Research Librarian at the University of California, Berkeley, and was previously the Social Sciences Data Librarian at Colby College in Maine. She has led workshops on qualitative data management and on ethnographic assessment in libraries and enjoys helping other librarians learn to conduct qualitative research. Thank you both. Take it away when you're ready.
Okay. So let's just go to the next slide, and there's pictures of us. So that's us. I'm Monica, and I want to thank you, Erin, so much for letting us do this webinar, and also a warm welcome to everyone who is attending today. And we would love to get your thoughts on how you work with community users in your libraries after we present, and if people have some points they want to discuss during our presentation, let's just wait for the end after we're done, and then we will take those. So what can I say? So we began the study because we had done a focus group with our library assistants the year prior to the study, Celia and I. And Celia is a qualitative research librarian and also an anthropologist, and she is very skilled in doing interviews with people and getting people to reveal interesting data. And so when we did this focus group, we found some unexpected insights and things that we could do almost immediately to improve services for our patrons as well as our library assistants that didn't cost anything. So we thought, oh, this is such an interesting way to do a study. Let's try to continue this with a different population of users. And let's study at that point, at our academic reference desks, we help a lot of community patrons. And when we say community patrons, they're the same as unaffiliated patrons, which means patrons who are not our current students, staff, or faculty. So when we work with them, we have to navigate around some of the constraints which they face in our institutions because they are not our primary patrons. And so we thought because they're facing these constraints on their access, they would be an interesting population of users to get a sense of their experience of our libraries. So Initially, we started to work with the Asian American Studies librarian, Sine Huang Jensen from the Ethnic Studies Library here at UC Berkeley also. And so what we did was we studied the patrons of our 3 subject libraries, which is anthropology, business, and ethnic studies libraries, with the 3 branch libraries here, 3 of the 24 branch libraries here. So let's go on to the next slide. So here's what we hope you get from the study that we did. And it's basically about listening to community users and hearing what they say to us in our different interactions, and then using that data to improve library services for low cost and minimal investment in time. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a snapshot of unaffiliated access to academic libraries in the last 60 years. So what we see is through the 1960s, academic libraries have liberal policies and a sense of generosity and idealism in allowing free access to anyone who needed scholarly resources. And this was sort of influenced by the 19th century free public library movement. And as you know, prior to that, academic libraries had been more guarded about their resources. So, but we get into the 1960s, and begins a really expansive growth in higher education in the United States. There's more college students than ever, and science and technology industries are, on the upswing, and they're requiring college-educated workers. So we're getting this large expansion. And in the library literature, but what we see by the 80s and 90s is the quantification of the costs for unaffiliated access. The cost for reference services, cost for replacement materials, cost for library access for students are being calculated. And studies are starting to show that unaffiliated patrons account for a quarter to almost half of all reference inquiries. And they're also more time consuming because they're not as familiar with our collections. A quarter of the cost of replacement materials is from unaffiliated. And this was a study we saw which looked at 2 different academic libraries. There are starting to be these arguments that several hundreds of dollars of student tuition is going towards library services, but these are services which community patrons are getting for nothing. And at the same time, there are, particularly in urban settings, security issues which are unignorable. So there's getting to be a tension with librarians who don't want to deny access, but nevertheless are starting to feel constrained by the ground realities of providing unfettered access. So let me give an example of what we did here at Berkeley in 1991. And that was in response to student complaints about overcrowding and difficulties in getting services and needed materials. And I was a student here in the 1980s at Berkeley, and it was a common amongst students and among faculty, this common meme that the UC Berkeley Library had the best card catalog, period. Because it was blind luck that would determine if you were able to access anything in the catalog. It was either checked out or on search or missing or question mark, who knows? So in 1991, UC Berkeley Library began restricting access to community patrons. Our undergraduate library became off limits to anyone from the community. The main library could be accessed by California residents only with a community library card for an annual fee. Our branch libraries, however, and we are in branch libraries, were always permitted walk-in access. So anybody could come in and browse our collections, but they couldn't check them out unless they had a library card. We also established borrowing limits for community users, a little more restrictive, quite a bit more restrictive. And there was a paper that was published in 1993, and it's by Jansen. It was published in the Reference Services Review. It's called Welcome or Not, Here They Come, Unaffiliated Users of Academic Libraries. And that paper quoted a Berkeley librarian as saying that these restrictions were the single best thing the library had done to improve services for students in several decades. So let's go to the next slide. Then we move into the 21st century, and we're starting to see a lot of changes in the information landscape, in information delivery and information access. Digital information availability is available on personal devices, remotely. People are doing more internet searches for information, and keyword searches of information databases take off. And our patrons, particularly students and some faculty, unfortunately, feel like they need less of their information needs from the library. They can get it on the internet. There's less of a need for library books even, or physical books. And we're starting to see in the academic world anyway, that reference inquiries have been going down in this last couple of decades. At the same time, we have academia is being asked to prove its value to the community. And we start to see public outreach become important to the university more than ever. This kind of town-gown relations are becoming to be emphasized. And there's a demand that this publicly funded research, what comes out of it, should be made available to the public with fewer barriers. And so today now we are starting to see a lot of interesting partnerships between academia with their communities. And these are growing. And a lot of academic libraries as well. There's a book by Courtney that was published in 2009 by Libraries Unlimited called the 2009 Academic Library Outreach Beyond the Campus Walls, which has a lot of very interesting stories about how different libraries across the country are opening up to community access, not so much to community access, but in doing different partnerships. It's quite interesting. And then there's of course a push for open access and so on, which libraries and universities are very much involved in, partly in response also to publisher attitudes. So, so reference services are less impacted. There's less wear and tear on digital materials. There's more space to accommodate needs of community users. And so today, nearly all university libraries, public and private, offer access to the community, though mostly for a fee. And although I should say small town and smaller universities tend to still not charge fees, but urban universities and larger areas almost universally do. There's borrowing limits, there's limited services, for instance, no interlibrary loan. There's restrictions on computer use to library materials only. Here at Berkeley, we charge a $100 annual fee, but I found in the literature some that charged up to $1,000 or more annually. Our e-resource licenses generally allow walk-in access by anybody, but we do have a few databases that are restricted to the current students only. And it seems like some of those are getting increasingly restrictive, particularly in business where I work, and in engineering and some of the sciences. So anyway, so that's a sort of general landscape within which our community users are navigating in our library. So we wanted to respond to this gap in the literature by looking at the experience and point of view of the community user in the academic library who's experiencing limits on their access, rather than from the point of view and experience of librarians or library administration, which is where all the literature is from on this topic so far. So let's move to the next. And so our research was basically on who are our patrons and how do they experience this access? What are the challenges they face? how does the library fit into their scholarly needs and their life needs? So we planned to interview between 18 to 20 people initially about their library experience. And we wanted people who had used our 3 libraries specifically, which is anthropology, business, and ethnic studies. And we also wanted users who had sufficient experience, more than a one-time experience of being in our library. So we would get some richer content. And we didn't want recent graduates as a result, because we didn't want somebody who had not experienced our library with that kind of limited access that unaffiliated patrons face. So that was our main criteria. We did offer a stipend of $40 for an hour-long interview, which is very generous. Most studies, if they pay, will be at the most 15 to 25. We didn't advertise the amount of the stipend because we didn't want to encourage people who just wanted to do it for the money. We thought that we'd get a better response if we didn't advertise it. And of course, the money for the stipend we were able to get from a grant from our Statewide Librarians Association. So let's go to the next slide. I want to talk about our recruitment, because we thought this would be sort of the easy part. People would sign up, but we found that this was probably our most challenging part. We had wanted to interview 18 to 20 people, but we ended up stopping at 10 because we had tried recruiting for 6 months and weren't getting really good interview subjects. So what our most successful tool was the flyers that we put up in our 3 libraries. We had to use a passive strategy because for recruitment, because we didn't want to put pressure on people. We didn't want them to feel emotionally or psychologically burdened by our request. So we just wanted them to contact us if they were interested. And so we put up flyers, and I put an email signature. In my email signature, I put, like, I'm doing a study, please contact me. I get a lot of questions from unaffiliated patrons through the email. Our information is easily available on our websites, our contact information. And I got nobody from that. I posted on Nextdoor, which is a bulletin board app for the town of Berkeley. And I got interest, but we'd only really found one person who would be suitable for our study. And Facebook didn't get us anything. We put up flyers at our nearby public library, which is 2 blocks from our campus, because we thought, there would be a lot of cross traffic between our 2 libraries. But it turned out most of them that contacted us didn't really use our library, and they conflated the 2. They just thought the 2 libraries were the same. So here's pictures of our research study flyers that we put up. The one on the left is made by Melissa Stoner, who's our Native American Studies librarian, and it has little pull-off tabs on the bottom with our contact information. And the one on the right was made by Amy Chin, who is a library assistant here. And the bear on the bottom left is our university mascot, the cow bear. When we interviewed, we had a set of 10 questions that we used to sort of structure our interview so that we would get, and these questions are some fairly simple questions which are to draw people out about their experience. And as I mentioned earlier, Celia is very highly skilled at doing this kind of research and thinking out how to do what kind of questions to ask that would draw people out. And she's very skilled at listening, which is really the important part of it. The kind of questions, very simple. How did you come to use the Berkeley libraries? What typically brings you to the libraries? What services do you use? How do you decide when to use a public versus an academic library? So anyway, these questions are posted in our paper. We have them in an appendix. So if anybody wants to see these, they're there. I think they're very good questions for doing a qualitative kind of experience. What is your experience kind of interview? So here's some of the responses that people gave. And Celia will go in much more detail after this on what we learned and what people said. But here's one. We have to have these physical books with a beautiful illustration. That was Pat, who brought in middle school kids to our libraries. The middle school does not have a good school library. So she would bring them to our reading room with these grand coffee table type of books with beautiful illustrations and stuff. And, just to get a sense of what there is in the world out there. And then Taylor, in response to how she came here, I live close by and I can just go there to the library to study. And similarly with Casey, it's easier for me to come to UC, and I thought that the offerings might be broader versus at a public library. And Jody, in response to a public library, compared to public library, it's quieter. And the environment of all these serious studiers helps with distractions. And Pat, again, she says, I come here for databases if I want to find some credible information. So I'm going to turn this over to Celia now, and she can take you through the rest of our findings, which are actually quite fascinating and interesting. And then hopefully we'll have a discussion at the end of this with you all.
Thank you, Monica. So yeah, we just wanted on this slide to give you guys a brief idea of some of the specifics, because we realized we gave you this long list of questions. And then we kind of jumped both in our paper and in this presentation almost immediately to some of the high-level themes that we uncovered, but we didn't give you pictures of some of the specific answers that we were getting. And we know that if you're thinking about your community patrons, you might be sort of wondering, why were they coming to our library? Why did they come to us versus a public library? And some of those kind of more grounded questions. But as we looked at a lot of these very specific answers from the 10 people that we talked with, and we went over the transcripts, we started pulling out themes that surprised us a little bit. And that's what we want to cover next before we kind of go on then to a discussion with you and take some of your questions and maybe pose some questions of our own. Some of the insights that we came up with as a whole, and again, we realize this is a sort of a pilot study. It's 10 interviews. We didn't get as many interviews as we hoped, but we did start seeing what I call saturation, in that we did start seeing the same themes come up again and again, even in this small set of people. Is that the community users often didn't know what was available to them, even people who had used our library frequently. They were unaware of things that they could access and should access. None of them had ever actually approached a librarian for a reference interview or structured interaction. They maybe talked to someone at the desk briefly, and that was it. They came to the library to use our spaces, our collections, and maybe for special events, but hadn't interacted with us. And these were often people that we weren't really aware were using our libraries until they approached us for this research interview. So it became an opportunity for us to meet people. All of them reported experiencing a persistent sense of non-belonging, which maybe was part of what led them to reach out to our kind of call for interviews, that made them hesitant to ask for help or sometimes made them feel a little bit alienated. And we found it really interesting that each of our research interviews, which we designed for us to learn to know more, actually became a reference interaction, that the users walked away learning something more that we could share with them as we talked about some of their pain points or some of the questions they had about the library. And I wanted to give you a little bit of that sense and flavor of some of the quotes that we got from people so that you can hear a little bit of their stories. So one of the first themes we got was, I don't belong here. And we had quotes like, I'm not a student here, so I feel weird about being here. I just feel like an outsider coming into a different environment. This is an external grad student. So she says, it's a university. It feels like I'm home, but it's not really. She's not sure how to relate to our libraries as compared to her home libraries. Pat, the teacher we mentioned earlier, and we've given everyone pseudonyms here. You don't feel like you could be part of this library because it's on campus and it's a luxury to be here. This kind of feeling of, I don't belong on the campus. Jesse, another external grad student. If I was a Cal student, I wouldn't want my library to be serving the public. I would want them to serve me, and you guys have so many students. And Skylar, who was an older alumna. It's funny, the whole time I've been here, I felt a little guilty, like, am I really supposed to be here? And then I saw your research, and I was like, they actually want to talk to me. And several people kind of commented on the way in which they felt maybe unsure of whether they really belonged in the library or not, but then when we reached out saying, hey, we want to do interviews with you, it actually signaled, you're allowed to be here, you belong here. I didn't realize the community was so welcome at Berkeley. I thought it was just students and the faculty. And we're actually a university, unlike some large public universities that might have closed access. Outside of those one or two libraries like the undergraduate library, all of our libraries are very open to the community. You can come and use it, you just can't check out the books without a library card. But even then, people were reporting this sense of, I'm not sure if I can be here or not. I may get kicked out because I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not going to make any waves. Somebody said, I feel like a thief if I just come and read the books without checking them out, but I don't want to pay for a year's pass. And then we asked them, okay, why do you come here? Why do you want to be here? And Justice talked about this experience of creation and feeling like you have this experience being channeled through you. It's not like other places. It's an intimate space, a cross between some place that's home but is also studious. So she comes to the academic library because it's not like other places available in the town for her to be doing creative or studious work. Jody comments that cafes are more bustling, but I feel guilty that I stay there for 5 hours. Here I don't feel that. I can be here for 5 hours. I can study. So I don't go to cafes that much anymore. So she's found a place where it's public, where she feels like she's allowed to study. And other people reported coming because we are a large university and we have some specialized collections, for some of the specific collections that we have. With Pat saying, somebody saved this paper and probably they thought it would never be used, but 100 years later in a different part of the world, we can find it in a physical library, and it's amazing. Jamie remembering a time when she could only get a newspaper from Bhutan at this particular library, and similarly Taylor saying, I wanted to do research on Yeats and you couldn't find that information anywhere, but it was in the special collections. We ended up with a whole section, which I won't go into detail here, on the way that they perceive different spaces, and we found it especially interesting with the move that many academic libraries, especially larger ones, have towards consolidation and closing the branches. And we obviously work in branches, so we're a little bit biased, but we did find people saying that some of the larger libraries were impersonal, there weren't people visible to help, they were intimidating, maybe there was security, compact shelving, they weren't sure how to work with it. And that they gravitated in particular to some of the smaller libraries. With Justice commenting, I've been thinking about the luxury of the main library and how everything is set in marble, and then there's this small ethnic studies library stashed away. And she seeks it out and uses it specifically because she wants to support this space and what it represents to her in terms of the history of ethnic studies. Similarly, Carrie was saying she would come and use the anthropology library. Finally, they talked about events. And so people said that especially if they weren't actually active faculty, students, staff at a university, that library events were a way for them to feel connected to the intellectual community on a campus. They called it more intimate and valuable than going to a conference, magical, something that brings them into an intellectual space. So we had all of these kind of interesting responses and reflections, as well as some really specific requests. People said they wanted things like lockers, that they wanted to be able to have a library card that could be for 1 month or for a summer instead of for an entire year if they were only going to be in town for a short amount of time. And we then faced this question of what do we do with this? We're not the library managers, we're regular librarians that kind of did this pilot study. And how do we kind of get this information out there? The first thing that we did was we created brochures to actually welcome community users to our specialty libraries. Again, with the help of Amy Chen, who was our kind of graphic design staff member in the social science libraries at Berkeley. And this is an example. The little boxes shouldn't be there. That's just because we copied the digital file, I think. But you can kind of see the front and back here of a welcome card to visitors and community members that explains the services that are specifically available to them at the business library, so that it's clear, even if you're a community member who may or may not have purchased the library card access, all of the things that they can still do with business resources at the business library, and that they can contact the business librarian. Another thing we did was to report out to our public services team. So we did meet with the team responsible for outreach and for determining policies to explain some of the concerns that we'd heard and some of the experiences from people, so that they could take some of those things forward as they consider developing policies that affect their community users. And we created this poster sharing with other campus librarians during a research poster session at our campus so that the other librarians could hear some of what we learned. We shared through a publication, which is available online, open access, and then we're now sharing it out with you. So this has been our way to try and take this pilot study on something that we felt was understudied and that there wasn't a lot of information on how community users actually experience academic libraries. And turn it around and try to get that voice into the literature and into the conversation on our own campus. And at this point, we're open to your thoughts, but we also have some questions for you to take home and think about. And our questions for you are, how does your library reach out to community users? How have you found it necessary to limit community use? Have you encountered licensing issues and how have you communicated those? Have you engaged in a listening tour with your community? Do you track requests or usage types coming from unaffiliated versus affiliated users? And do you have other questions for us? So thank you very much for listening. I hope this is interesting and useful for you, and we're happy to entertain a discussion now.
Okay, if you have any questions or would like to respond to their questions, please just post into the group chat. Should be on the bottom right. If you don't see the box, if you hover toward the bottom of your screen and click the chat button, the box should open up.
So this is Erin, and I have, and I know that Penn State has a unique position in Pennsylvania where we provide community use and community user support up to a point. At my small campus library, we're probably a block from the public library, maybe 2 blocks away, and we do get some community borrowers. The main campus, University Park, has started a combination with the public library where if somebody were to drop off a public library book there, they can, they'll just, take it down to the public library for themselves. And then somebody just sent me a question privately from Olivia. Were the Berkeley interviews only with users that had paid a usage fee?
Most of them were not. So most of them were people who had not chosen to pay the $100 a year fee, and that was part of the challenge that they encountered.
Yeah, I think there was like one I remember specifically that had discovered using our libraries because they had brought their son on a tour, the campus tour, and that's where, as an alum, she learned that as an alum, she had access to the libraries, and that's when she got her library card. But, yeah, most of them were folks who did not have a library card. They just came in and didn't find out that much more. Mainly because they felt like they didn't belong here, so they didn't want to ask.
And speaking as a qualitative researcher, I think that's one of the challenges with a population like this, is that we knew that we didn't have permission to contact people who did have community borrower cards, because when they had signed up for those, the agreement that they had signed said that they wouldn't be contacted about anything besides issues with their account. So we couldn't use that list, but that also didn't reflect who we got. There are a lot of people who use our library who don't pay for those cards. So it's kind of not a known population, and it's hard to locate these people.
So we have a question in the chat box from Rachel. We're finding some challenges working with our central IT, though, when it comes to printing or access to software. Is this something that you experience? Any thoughts or advice on that? The printing is a little different because what we have is a 2-tiered system. So our community patrons pay more to print than do our regular patrons, and everyone has to have a print card. We do have at our desks little guest cards that people can use, but they have to put money on them, which they can do online with their credit card, and then they can use that to print. It's not ideal, but that's what we have. And we do have scanners which are free. People can just scan to their USB or sent to their email. So that's one of the things we've been doing. I don't know if other people have something they do differently. I would love to hear that too.
I would say two things. First, we can potentially put you in contact with some people from Access Services who deal more with some of the technical restrictions and issues. Second, in my role as the qualitative research librarian, one of the things that I run into is that people want access to qualitative analysis software like Atlas TI and NVivo, which is very expensive and which our library can't provide. So we partner with other institutes or centers on campus that we can send them to, like the data center or something like that. And potentially some community members could use some of those resources as well, but it isn't directly through the library. It would depend on the software.
And then we have a question from Jen. How do you respond to virtual community users? We have a fairly strict policy concerning providing copies of library materials to community patrons. Only for archives materials, all others must use ILL through their public or home library. Is this the norm or policy we should be evaluating? We don't do ILL for our community patrons at all here. We encourage them to go to the public library for that. So that's our policy. And I think that's pretty common in university libraries. Is if somebody has a different policy, we would love to know that too.
Tagging off that, one of the other things I would say is I've had interesting conversations recently with the Graduate Theological Union, which is right next to our campus. And traditionally, we had an understanding with them where they collected theology books and we collected more secular books on religion. And our students who were physical could use each other's materials. And we're now having challenges because we collect ebooks that are restricted to our campus only, and they collect ebooks for their virtual students. And that sort of ability to walk into a nearby campus doesn't work at the point that we're all switching to ebooks. So that's something we really still haven't resolved in terms of access for, say, their online students, when they used to just have print students that would walk in person.
And I would say that's true of e-resources in general. This is a more complicated relationship with that when our licenses restrict in some way how you can access them or who can access them in some cases. Most ebooks are not that restrictive, but I'm sure there's cases that I don't know about, particularly in engineering, where we would run into that.
This is Erin. I ended up getting a question in the chat, privately sent, about offering programming specifically for community members, tours or orientations, and then what events are most successful. Do you guys do that at all?
Say that again.
Programming specifically for community members. Do you offer any?
At this point in the anthropology library, we don't, although I don't offer a lot of programming in general. My colleagues in the ethnic studies library do a lot of outreach specifically to the ethnic studies community and not just to their students. Mm-hmm. And then we have a Morrison library where we hold a lot of events. And so many of our community users reported coming to these kind of book talk events that brought in outside authors that are advertised out into the community, but they're not only for community users.
Yeah, the library has a very strong relationship with the community because a lot of the community members are alums, for one thing. And they offer, the main library offers tremendous amounts of public programs. And a lot of departmental conferences and stuff are also open to the public, and often these are hosted in the library. So people think of them as library events, even though they're departmental. At the business library, we don't really have any events at all. We're a virtual library. We don't have any books either. But it would be great, you know, if we had events, they would always be open to the community.
One of the other groups that our campus has specifically outreach to is that the Bancroft Special Collections Library and Archive every other year hosts Breath of Life, which is to help Indigenous California Native communities reconnect to archival materials about their language and culture that may have been kind of separated from their community and to help them revitalize their languages. And for that, they do have tours that are specifically for these community members coming in from outside of the anthropology library or ethnic studies library. And that's a kind of specific event, but it's a good example of where the library has built a partnership with local communities, in this case, Native communities.
And there was a comment here from Jacqueline from Penn State was given a generous donation by an unaffiliated user expressing gratitude and appreciation for the role the University Park Penn State libraries have played in her life as a community member over several decades. Another mentioned the libraries and the dedication of their book, thanking the libraries for the support provided with their research. Community members can be assets to an academic library. And you're so right. That's one of the main reasons I think it's really good to have provide access to the community. It makes for so much goodwill, and it's just sort of it's so wonderful to see people be able to do research, especially with materials that are not being used. They should be used. And but interestingly, we found a couple of research studies that somebody had done where they assumed that if they provided access to the community, that the community would be grateful and support the library with donations. And it's a study by Dole and Hill, which I think we cite in our paper, which talked about what they found was they actually did not get that much in the way of monetary support. But what you're saying there, Jacqueline, I think is also very common. I think it happens a lot that you get donations from unaffiliated users because they have used our libraries and are grateful.
I think that study was also more short-term in nature, where they provided access and then sent requests for donations, and people weren't super forthcoming to a mailed request for donations.
And here's a comment. Oh, somebody's here from the University of Saskatchewan. Rachel, here at the University of Saskatchewan Library, we do provide some programming for high school programs in the city. We have a relationship with our international baccalaureate programs in particular, where the students get library cards and have 2 or 3 sessions in the library in their senior high school years. Does anybody else work with high school programs? You know, we found in the literature there was talk about high school students being some of the biggest users. I'm looking at literature back from the 70s and 80s. I don't know what it is today, but there was some talk about that. And in fact, at the time, librarians did not like to serve the high school students, it seemed. There was more of that they were more troublesome. But
I think one of the tones that we encountered in the literature that was part of why we did this study was a lot of fear sometimes or frustration with maybe the more difficult patrons that you sometimes encounter. And yet my own experience is there's always that handful of unusual or difficult folks, and yet there's a lot of folks, often unnoticed, sometimes noticed and appreciated, who do come in and out that really are not using a lot of resources, but really are enjoying and making good use of the resources they do use. So we kind of wanted to be a little bit of a counterpart to some of what we saw in the literature.
And Erin says her campus works with the high school students. We also have some programs here with Girl Scouts. Oh, that's so interesting. I wonder what high school students come for. It would be an asset.
So this is Erin. They come in for a particular class where they're also getting college credit for, but then there's another class that comes in that is not quite affiliated with the college credit classes. And so sometimes the students will come in because they know or have heard somewhere that it is a community place that they can get some research books for their class projects. So they'll come down here and get those.
Interesting. Their class projects books are in the academic library. Do they have a library? The school itself?
Some of them do, some of them don't.
Yeah, I guess a lot of K through 12 schools don't have as good of libraries in California either. Some do, but many of them don't. And a lot of the times a public library will take that place for them.
And so we have another question about campus regulations or risk management rules about working with minors. And for those that work with minors, how do we navigate this? So this is Aaron, and in Penn State, everybody has to get cleared by the FBI to work here. And we do this, and then we do training as well. So I'm not sure how it is at other universities.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that you would need that. And why do you need to be cleared by the FBI?
It's a background check, basic. It's an extra background check that everyone had to go through after the Jerry Sandusky scandal.
Oh.
And I believe
Yes.
that everybody in Pennsylvania who works in higher ed has to do it. They made it a state law.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else I know of has to do that to work in a college.
I don't think our campus has regulations on working with minors. We do tend to not leave students alone working evenings and weekends. At least in our division, we try to have adults available so that they're not in a small library isolated by themselves, but that's a different issue.
Mm-hmm.
And they're adults, all our student workers, I think. I mean, we do have the very, very rare students that are not quite 18 yet. But Jacqueline had a comment there that community goodwill is an asset you will not know you need until you face a challenge in your community. Right on. It's true. What do you say? That you left the dollar amount off the recruitment flyers. This is Kathleen saying that because you worried about recruiting participants who only wanted the financial incentive. Could you talk a little bit more about that decision? Ooh, Celia, you want to take that?
Sure. I think initially we were curious. We thought we're in a large urban area. There's millions of people near us. We thought we might get a lot of people, and we didn't need to list it. After things were slow, we probably should have gone ahead and listed it. I don't know that we helped ourselves by leaving that off. It might have been more of an incentive to go ahead and actually list the dollar amount of the incentive. So I don't really have a good reasoning for why we did that, looking back.
Yeah, we were a little bit muddied about that. I'm not sure what we were thinking. That if you offered somebody a financial incentive, they may just do it for that rather than because we thought, oh, they really want to talk to us. Instead of they just want the money. And Aaron's posted the links for the credit form and the evaluation form.
Yeah.
Jacqueline says, yeah.
Does anybody else have any other comments or questions? Oh, Jacqueline's question.
Jacqueline
Do you
has a
expect there
question.
to be changes in your library as the result of your findings? Any further changes? Because you already talked about some of the ones that happened.
Yeah, the changes we had were basically very minimal. What we did on our part was to make it easier for our community patrons to feel more welcome. But the large-scale changes, we basically talked to our public services team and let them know these are our results. I don't think we have that much say in the larger library policies, but basically it's like we hope that librarians on our campus will understand that making community users feel welcome is a good thing and not be afraid of it, and hopefully librarians elsewhere too.
I think it's made us more aware of the benefit of outreach, the fact that you won't be swamped. Probably if you outreach, you don't need to be afraid of it. And to keep that in mind, to keep the community user perspective and experience in mind. I want to do more outreach in my library, and I have not done that yet. But but that's an intention of mine. And just to make sure that when we do run events, that we make sure that it is posted in the community and not just on campus, that there's no reason to limit that to the campus if it really is open to everybody else. And the one final thing is that a person who was running our offsite storage, when they heard about our program, did say, oh yes, this would be very interesting. And so there was interest in campus on maybe replicating that at some of the other service points and trying to better understand why users go to some of those other service points to do a study like this. So
that would be interesting. Is anybody out there thinking about expanding outreach to community users? I think in Pennsylvania, we have a mandate that if you are community funded in some way through taxes, then you are supposed to have access to your collections in some manner. Is that the same in California?
I don't believe it's a real mandate, but I think in practice, all the state colleges and community colleges and all the state funded institutions do have some kind of access. And I'm not sure if it's just a thing of goodwill, and this is sort of our ethical responsibility because we're publicly funded, or whether there's a mandate. I actually don't know.
And I guess the final thing I would say is that we set this up as a formal research study, but you could also do this as an informal listening tour. And we just saw a lot of benefit from getting out there, listening to our community users and being kind of refreshed by hearing that experience and being more aware of their needs. So if it's something you're thinking about, I certainly think it's worthwhile to just kind of find ways to go out there and kind of make people aware of the fact that you're listening and you want to know more about what community users can use from your library.
It's a good way to breach that town and gown gap that can exist.
Oh, definitely. And, I think in our business library, I think, it would be just great to have entrepreneurs and because this is such a big, vital entrepreneurial area with so many startups and stuff, if they could sort of just know that we were available to them to help them as well. But I haven't actually done any outreach on that myself. Although I have to say, I just love working with community patrons. They're just so interesting. They come from all these different walks of life. And, they're so different from students in their projects and based stuff. And, I came from a public library. So I really sort of miss that broader community, which I don't get in the academic library so much.
Right. Yeah. Right. Rachel just has a comment. They just hired a director of external engagement, and part of that person's role is to build stronger relationships with the community. As part of that, you're hoping to see programming for both on-campus and off-campus users, debates, presentations, etc.
Oh, that's great. I think you'll have it'll make your campus more vital. And I hope the libraries are part of that. You can use the libraries to host some of those, I hope.
Right, and someone else posted that Penn State is one of 4 statewide library resource centers. We have a legislative mandate to serve the citizens of the Commonwealth. So,
nice.
Okay, so keep the comments coming in if you'd like, but we will wrap up. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and Monica and Celia especially for presenting for us. Erin did post the links for the CE credit in the chat, as well as a link to the survey. The survey is to let us know your thoughts about the presentation today and about our programming in general. As a reminder, the recording for this presentation will be available on the Pennsylvania Library Association members early next week through the website. And if you're not a Pennsylvania Library Association member and you're interested in becoming a member, feel free to email me and I'll have the appropriate person contact you. And also, I invite you to contact me with your suggestions for future discussions and presentations, and I most definitely invite you to contact me if you would like to present. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a nice afternoon or a nice weekend. And I will put my email address in the chat just in case somebody does want to contact me.
Well, this is Monica, and I want to thank everyone for attending, and especially for all those great comments and questions at the end. Really enjoyed those. I wish we could sit down together and shoot the breeze on that with all of you sometime.
Do you want to go back to your first slide with your contact info? Or your last slide?
Our last slide. We have it here. So yes, you guys are welcome to contact us. We'd love to hear about this or anything else that you'd want to get in contact about. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks, Diana, for monitoring and taking care of all the logistics. And Aaron.
Mostly Aaron.
And Aaron, thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
It's been nice.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.